Welcome everyone to Fairy Tale Flip episode 6. My name is Vanessa Y. Rogers and I have a podcast called Fabric of Folklore, and my co-host who is collaborating on this wonderful journey, this monthly fairy tale deep dive, is Donna Lee Fields of Scaffolding Magic. And she also has a podcast, Doorways to Learning, where she talks about education. And we come together on a monthly basis to look at one fairy tale and really go into depth and understand its historical context and understand its hidden meanings and just understand our current world in the context of the fairy tale, or the other way around. But so we are super glad that you are here with us today. And we also enjoy this format because we always give our audience 3 options from which to choose what fairy tale we're going to do a deep dive on. So this month, which ones did we choose?
We were doing Pinocchio, The Smith and the Devil, and the third one was
The Fairy in the Night, which is a King Arthur legend.
I love this.
Yeah, and so that was really interesting. I chose that one because someone suggested the King Arthur tale, and I chose one that had a fairy in it because this is Fairy Tale Flip. So
Nice.
I thought it would just go with the theme. But the audience actually was tied with Pinocchio and The Smith and the Devil, at least on my polls. And so we went with The Smith and the Devil. I chose it partially because my husband is a blacksmith, so I was interested in that. What were you interested in, The Smith and the Devil? What made you gravitate towards that one?
Well, I mean, I told you I really like the whole duality and looking at the devil as evil, and maybe we can look at the devil as not evil. So we're going to talk about why. So the duality of that and why we just automatically react to people because of the names, because of their labels. Yeah. And a lot of people listen to it, and I thought that was really nice also. And so we're going to, but as you said, what we're going to do is do Pinocchio in June and July. So we will look into that one as well.
Yes, we'll give the options. So one of the things that we've been talking about is giving the options that were not chosen in the past in June and July. So you have the option to re-choose ones that weren't chosen. But we also have some options that were suggested to us this month for May, which seem really good. But why don't we start with giving the synopsis of the Russian version of The Smith and the Devil, which is the one that we have up on our YouTube channels.
Yes, absolutely. And just to repeat, you're welcome to ask us questions or comments in the chats in my YouTube channel and Vanessa's Instagram, and we will answer them. Okay. The version that we're going to talk about today, I thought that actually I was reading the oldest fairy tale known on the planet, which is also called The Smith and the Devil. It turns out that this is not the same one. It's a Russian fairy tale, but I actually fell in love with it. And Vanessa and I will talk about a little bit about why. And it's really just about a smith who goes to church every day, and he sees the picture of the devil, a painting of the devil on the walls of the church in the picture of the Last Judgment, and loves it, and has an artist in the village painted on his walls in his smithy, and he blesses him every day as he walks by him. And so he does really well. He passes on to the next world. His son, his 15-year-old, 16-year-old son, takes over the smithy and hates the painting of the devil and spits on it and hammers his head. And the devil loses patience and goes down and teaches him a lesson. And so that's the story we're going to be talking about.
And there's some burning of people, and they come out as young again. It's a very dramatic story.
There's at one point, the devil learns all he can about the smithy from the 16-year-old blacksmith, the new blacksmith, and he offers to turn a woman into a younger version of herself. She agrees. He turns her into a younger version. She insists that her husband have the same treatment. It doesn't work out that well. But at no point, this is really important, at no point does the devil kill the blacksmith who has been so disrespectful to him. And so that's what I really would like to focus on, along with a lot of other things Vanessa has mentioned. So So you ready to dive
So
in?
what did you like about the Russian version? Yeah, for sure. What was it that you liked about this Russian version?
I never actually read the whole version of the oldest one, but what I understand it to be is the smith sold his soul to be the best blacksmith on the planet, and the devil agreed. And then the blacksmith became so powerful that he didn't want, but then he was going to die after he, lived a while as the best blacksmith in the world. And then he decided he didn't want to die, and so he threatened the devil, finally won, and he lived happily ever after until he died naturally. This one is a little different. This one is about reverence to the devil, which I find fascinating because it's the disrespect in the first version, and it starts with respecting the devil in the Russian version. So my question when I was uploading posts to get people excited about this session with you and me is it okay to label people and then treat them however you want just because the majority feels very positively about that person or feels very negative about the person? What do you think?
I think everyone needs to be, well, I don't know. I was going to say everyone deserves to be respected and, treatment of kindness, but I guess I actually don't believe that necessarily, depending on their actions towards other people. I would like to say that is my general being. I like to try and be kind to the majority of people, but there are specifically, politicians that grate me, that I don't feel like I could be kind to. So, um, uh, I feel like in general it's important to show kindness to even people that you don't feel deserve kindness. One of the things that they teach as a parent to children who go to school is that bullies, if you treat them with kindness, sometimes that counteracts their bullying nature. Like they don't know how to react when they bully you and then you come back with a compliment or with kindness. They don't know how to react to kindness. And so um that's a technique that's taught now. I don't know, I've never actually experienced using that technique, but I wonder how that would work in real life situations. But it is a really fascinating story in that the they he showed to the devil the entire time, and if he doesn't, then he's not a good blacksmith when when the sun takes over, right? When the sun takes over, he's no longer a very talented blacksmith. Is that accurate?
Not exactly, not exactly. And there's a comment from Laura. She said, "Is kindness the same as respect?" And I really appreciate that because what you're saying is treat someone who's being very aggressively negative with kindness. And I'm not sure if anyone, many people are able to act with kindness towards someone who's acting very, very aggressively negative, but respectful. I think we can all be respectful. And on a spiritual level, I think this is important to say because we're going to talk a little about religions and where the devil came into being and considered in religions. On a spiritual level, what we're supposed to do, the best thing we can do is just focus on everyone's divine presence. And if we can focus on, I look at you and I like you a lot. But what I also need to do is focus on your divine presence. And the politicians that are doing questionable things in the countries, well, if we focus on their divine presence, then it's not as if we're dealing with their 3D personality, their human body, but we are sort of targeting and energizing the best part of them that they even forget that they have inside of them. Does that make sense? So
Yes, yeah, and I think that's why the technique is suggested. Real Roy on Instagram says kindness, but you must show your teeth occasionally. So I like that. So I was really fascinated with the different variations, and you were saying that you didn't really look into the other variations. Do you want to talk a little bit about what I found in the different variations?
Let's talk about the different variations, and then what I'd like to do is talk about how the devil has come into being as a concept, because I think that's very important to be able to understand stories like this. Let's start with versions.
Okay, so there was a version in the Grimm fairy tale that was taken out after, I think, the second version, when they realized originally they were printing them for adults, and when they realized that children were enjoying them, they decided that the Smith and the Devil was one that they weren't going to include, which I find very interesting because they chose like Hansel and Gretel, where there's a witch who is a cannibal and their parents who abandon their children. But somehow the Smith and the Devil is not an appropriate children's story. So I'm not really sure what the thought process on that was, but so the story with the Grimm fairy tale is interesting. It's a little bit different than a lot of the other ones that I found. The blacksmith isn't granted powers from the devil. He's just given more life. So he's going to kill himself, and because he's poor and he's like spent his life savings on everything, and he's lived a debaucherous life, and the devil grants him more time and more money, but he gets to take his soul in 10 years. And then he ends up tricking the devil, and the devil doesn't get his soul. And then in the end, the blacksmith tries to go into heaven, but heaven won't take him because he hasn't been a good person, and hell won't take him because the devil doesn't like him. And then the devil ends up tricking heaven into taking this blacksmith. So he gets into heaven in the end. And so that's the story that is in the Grimm's fairy tale. I never found the one that is considered the original, and I'm not sure that there is one particular original, and we'll talk a little bit about that. There's two versions that are very similar, found in Scotland and in Appalachia, and I think that they're found in those two places because they are surrounded by, they have swamps and marshes and what is called the will-o'-the-wisps. And so instead of the blacksmith going into heaven, he's not allowed into either heaven or hell. And instead, the devil gives him a bucket full of coals and says, you can keep yourself warm with these. No one wants you. And so when you look out onto marshes and swamps, a lot of times people will see, when there's not light pollution, they'll see lights, and they're called will-o'-the-wisps. And so it's supposed to be in Appalachia, Wicked John, and I don't remember the name of the Scottish blacksmith who is wandering the swamps with his bucket full of coals. So I found that super fascinating. And then there's one that's more popular that people know that was made into movies. Faust. Are you familiar with Faust?
No, not that one. No. Tell us about it.
So Faust is not, it's taken from it. So there's stories, there's like movies and books made up about Faust. And even you can say there's an adjective, Faustian, implying sacrificing spiritual values for power, knowledge, or material gain. And basically it's very similar to the Grimm fairy tale. The devil gives him more time, and he spends his time being a good person. And so, but that one is more commonly used in language. So, okay, the Scottish Appalachian, there was an interesting one in the American West with shoeing the devil. The devil comes in, he comes in to get shoes like the horses get nailed to his feet, and he sees the blacksmith doing this, and he wants his own. And so the blacksmith says, okay, come back tomorrow, I'll put some shoes on you. And so the devil comes in and is like, you better put some shoes on me, I'm ready. And instead of putting them through the horn of the foot. I'm not really clear on foot anatomy of a horse, but generally there's a place that you can put the nails, and it's not painful for the horse. And then there is a place that you put the nails, and it is true for the devil's pronged feet, evidently. And so the blacksmith puts the shoes on incorrectly so that it's painful for the devil, and he can't take them off. And so the devil ends up leaving the blacksmith shop with these shoes on that he requested, but it's painful for him to walk, and he's not able to remove them. So those are the different versions that I found, but I never found a version that talked about the blacksmith, but the devil granting him the powers of blacksmithing, just powers of different techniques. In the Appalachian and the Scottish version, it's actually Saint Peter who comes in and grants him 3 wishes. And then because when he dies, he was not a good soul, then the devil claims his soul. So there's no actual deal with the devil in those 2 versions. It's Saint Peter who gives him 3 wishes. So I found that really interesting.
No, that is interesting, and you're actually you're referring to some of this. There's a story about Saint Dunstan, because I was interested in blacksmiths and mythology, and you're very familiar with this. We have Hephaestus, who is the eldest son of Zeus and Hera, and he was a blacksmith.
Mm-hmm.
Incredible blacksmith, magical. And then we have there's Wayland, which is Wayland in Nordic traditions. And he was considered evil because what I was trying to do is find out historically and mythologically blacksmiths' relationship to evil. And some of them were considered evil, but most of them weren't. And the one you were talking about with the horseshoes, I think
Mm-hmm.
that was the key for what they say is that was the key to why in blacksmith shops there's now a horseshoe there, because it sort of signifies I won, from the devil. But
yes, that was the end of the story. Yeah, exactly.
Right. But then we have Wayland in Nordic traditions, who was considered evil, a blacksmith. But the truth is that someone captured him and made him a slave and slashed his legs so that he couldn't escape. And yet he finally did escape. And so he did some awful things, but they did awful things to him as well, which is a really great tie to the story we're talking about, because the truth is in our story, the boy hits the painting of the devil with a hammer and spits on him, which is very disrespectful and also pretty aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the devil waits 3 years. In the story, he waits 3 years before he comes down. And he doesn't just come down and say, okay, you're dead. No, he comes down. First, he befriends him, and then he teaches him a lesson. He lets him learn a lesson. And at the end, he actually saves the blacksmith. So what is evil? What is evil? So we talked about some of the versions, and I think that's really interesting. Could we talk a little bit about how the devil got this reputation of being evil?
Yes. I would love to hear what you found about that.
Right, because the devil doesn't really appear in most fairy tales unless there's a religious note. Would you agree?
Yeah. And so this is interesting because this story is considered one of the oldest stories of fairy tales. And so it's actually pre-Christian. And so the versions that we hear today have a Christian tinge, right? Because they're coming through Christian lenses. But the older story wouldn't have had a devil from Christian mythology necessarily.
That's right. And that's largely because the devil was only considered, he really kind of only appeared as a concept of evil after Christ was born, after the ideology of Jesus as the Christ. And he wasn't automatically deemed as evil. But let's just say, I mean, and this is actually interesting because Lucifer, who also many of us think, I'm not Christian, I wasn't brought up Christian. And so I don't have a lot of this sort of innate knowledge about what these personalities, these characters are supposed to be. But Lucifer, I always thought was a synonym for Satan. Is that what your understanding was? Lucifer and Satan are the same
Yes.
person? Okay.
Yeah, he was a fallen angel, and he was. I think Lucifer was an angel who meant light, and then he disobeyed God, and then he became the devil of the underworld.
That's right, because essentially, and this comes from ancient cultures, looking at the sky and the morning sun, and he was the son of dawn, the goddess Dawn, and he was the morning star. Well, and the morning star seems to fall when the day comes, and so people would look at it and think, oh, it's a fallen star, so it must live in the underworld and the darkness, and it sort of evolved into something being evil. But if we can go to the whole idea that our universe, our galaxy, I mean, everything in existence is about duality, we need the devil to be able to worship God, if that makes sense to you. And truthfully, in the Gnostic traditions, they did not consider God in the Judo-Christianic traditions all that wonderful. They actually thought Lucifer was the good guy and God was a little bit evil. So but there was always this duality. I know. I mean, go ahead.
Yeah. I was actually curious about this, and I wish I had looked into it a little bit more as well, because I started thinking about it right before we were going on, and so I did a little bit of research, because I was thinking about how this was, this is a story pre-Christianity, pre-birth of Christ, BC, and so there was the story has changed and evolved as all folk tales do. But I was curious what other cultures would have attributed the person, the devil, as. And so a lot of the cultures, they don't necessarily have an evil character. They have a trickster, one that's more a little bit ambivalent, like Loki in the Viking culture, right? Loki isn't evil, but he doesn't do great. And he sometimes is good and he's sometimes bad. And he's kind of like all over the place. He's a trickster. And a lot of different cultures don't necessarily have this devil character, but they do have a trickster character.
And again, it's just because a lot of people are looking at the Judeo-Christian God and thinking, how can a good God allow for evil in the world or sadness or suffering in the world? So they needed to have someone to blame for the suffering. And the devil became a concept. The other thing that I found really, really interesting is the devil's physical characteristics. How in the world did the devil get those physical characteristics? And what I found,
yeah, what did you find? That's super interesting.
What I found was the devil's characteristics comes from the Greek god Pan. And Pan is the god of wild, music, fun, celebration. And I hope that I will not offend debauchery. Thank you. And so hopefully I won't offend anyone by saying that the church often takes paganism and other mythology to sort of demonize, we could say, to demonize the characters so that people will only respect what the church says and not the Greek mythology or the Nordic or the Gnostic, whatever the traditions. And I say that because the church took this idea of Pan, and in Greek, so they took the idea that Pan would rile people up. And if they were too happy or if they were too languishing on the sofa, we didn't have sofas back then, but if they were not having a party, debaucherous, Pan would come in and sort of light a fire inside of them and they'd start celebrating. Well, the church didn't want people who were too happy, because then they wouldn't need the church, right? They needed to think that they needed a leader, and they needed to think that they were in a world of suffering. So Pan, so they took the characteristics of Pan, who was half fawn with cloven hooves, with horns, with hairy chest. And actually, he came to have red tights, but that's a whole other thing. I think that came from the Divine Comedy, Dante. So that's how we now have the devil, who has these physical characteristics that we're supposed to hate. And in fact, it was the Greek god of fun.
Oh, and is Pan related in any way to Dionysus from the Greek mythology? Because that's how I picture Dionysus. Is not a he doesn't have like hooves or anything, but he is the god of fun. I mean, he's the god of wine and parties and a good time.
Yeah, like Bacchus. I think that's the Roman name for it. Yeah. Yeah. And they're two different gods, but same idea. But poor Pan got his name sort of desecrated. But we know where it comes from. And actually, the word panic comes from that, pan, because if you're sitting around just sort of looking at life and all of a sudden something inside you goes, oh, let's party, let's go drink, let's go have sex, then there's like this, and we call it now panic, although originally it wasn't. It was just the spirit moves me to do something a little more exciting. Yeah.
Now, was Pan a trickster of any sort? Did he play tricks on people?
What I read, he wasn't a trickster. He really was. He just wanted to get people happy. Yeah.
He just wanted to have a good time. It's interesting because there was that movie that came out. Del Toro, Guillermo del Toro had that movie Pan back in the early 2000s, I believe, and it depicted, it's so long since I've seen that movie, but I don't think Pan was generally a good character in that movie either. Do you remember? Have you seen that one? It was in Spanish. It was made in Spain. I believe.
What was it about? Can you summary of that?
It took place during one of the Spanish wars. I believe it was a civil war. But I can't remember the storyline. But I now that you mentioned Pan, and I need to go back and look at that. So that's interesting. If anyone who's listening remembers that storyline, and if that character was actually a good character or a bad character or an ambivalent one, that would be interesting to hear. So that is really fascinating, that research and the devil. I did want to talk a little bit about how they determined that this story was the oldest fairy tale. Did you do any research on that?
No, because the truth is, what I keep trying to remind myself, and what I kept trying to put in the post, is that this is not the oldest version. So I really didn't focus on the oldest version, but I focused on the fact that it was about a blacksmith and the devil. And so there's some correlation between the two. And so then I went into, Laura says she saw the movie and didn't remember it. So, but I remember the director. The director's name sounds very familiar. So
he's very famous.
Yeah. I focused on the fact that the blacksmith and the devil were having this whole kind of collaboration, in a sense, through different versions. And
well, I do have thoughts on that as well, but I do want to talk a little bit about the Smith and the Devil. This Russian version might not be necessarily the oldest one, and I'm not sure that we have access to the original oldest one, but the story itself, the Smith and the Devil, is considered the oldest fairy tale. And there was this sociologist and anthropologist that took, they had this, and I'm not a linguist, and I don't really understand their scientific methodologies that they use, but they studied about 200 fairy tales, and they looked across the world into all sorts of different cultures, and they found the ones that were widespread. And so looked at the interactions between these different cultures, if they had any sort of trade, if they had any sort of migration, and if that's maybe how these fairy tales would have crossed. And so if there were cultures that had absolutely no interaction, then they were able to trace it back to what they called an Indo-European language. So pre-English, pre-Spanish, pre-German, a language that was basically one of those. And so there were several stories that fell within those realms, which included Rumpelstiltskin, which we talked about a couple episodes ago. So they determined that one is about 4,000 years old. Beauty and the Beast, the Jack and the Beanstalk, all of those fell under the Indo-European language, the pre-language to a lot of the languages that are spoken today. And then they determined that the Smith and the Devil was older than that one because it was found in even more cultures. And so they traced it further back into what is called a Proto-Indo-European language. And all this is hypothesized because obviously this was during the Bronze Age, and the Bronze Age was just when writing started to develop. It was the movement out of the Stone Age when they started to develop the skill to smith metals and to write, and to I think another thing is they developed the wheel during this Bronze Age. And so they think that this story was the only one that they could trace back that far, 6,000 years old. So that is quite incredible. And a lot of that history during that time period, we don't really have a lot of understanding because it's mostly based in archaeology. But somehow they were able to use scientific methods that usually biologists use when they're looking at genes and how genes mutate and have variances. They took that scientific method that biologists use to trace back genes to different animals from how they mutated, and they used that for fairy tales. And so that's how they determined that the Smith and the Devil is the oldest story known in modern times today, which I found super interesting. And if I'll link that study, but it was Sarah Gracia de Silva from the University of Lisbon, and Dr. Jamie Tarani from Durham University, and he's an anthropologist. And so I was kind of curious, like I wanted to understand what time period that was. So to give you a little bit of reference, the Old Testament is estimated to have been started. The stories came from as old as 2000 BC. So this story, I think, is slightly older, or at least around the same time. It happened. The stories started happening in the Bronze Age. So it's very. I'm not exactly sure the exact numbers, but I found that super fascinating, and especially how they looked at languages.
I think that's really interesting research, Vanessa. Again, we need to think about why it's the oldest story that we have. What is the correlation between the devil and the blacksmith? And we can look at the blacksmith as the alchemist, and the blacksmith actually has a lot of power in ancient civilizations. And paired with the devil, is there symbolism there that we're missing? I again say that.
Go ahead. What symbolism are you seeing?
I was just going to say that, in my opinion, in the oldest version that you're talking about, in the Russian version that I have been focusing on, the devil is not such a bad guy. The devil tries to teach the other person a lesson, and there's not this definitive evil that we're supposed to think of when we hear the Lucifer or the devil. Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah, so I'll go to some of the conversation that I had with my husband. He was saying that in order to move from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age, what they needed to develop was the ability to stoke a flame and to create a furnace, because you can have a fire, but a fire is not hot enough to smelt metal. And so you have to have the technology that furnace. And so that in itself was considered by some to be like alchemy, right? Or magic or witchcraft. And so a lot of smiths actually kept those their formulas and their furnace creations secret within their family. So it was kind of a secretive trade for some time, because they wanted to keep it just within their family. So they were able to monopolize, I guess. I'm not really sure. And so because of that, it was always seen, as you were saying, a reverence, because only certain people had this knowledge of how to do this particular skill. He said another thing that he would have seen as that people would have seen as witchcraft is that sometimes that you have to, and this is more, I think, in the Iron Age, when you're creating steel, you add specific metals to, when you're doing that and you're hammering, you often see flames like green or blue that are coming out of the flame. And that's the drawing out of impurities. And so someone looking in, seeing green and blue flames, would definitely have some ideas about what was happening in there. And then if you think about just in general, what a blacksmithing location is like, it's hot, it's fiery, there's always fire happening, it's often dark. My husband said that usually they would do all of their work at nighttime because it's easier to see, specifically like the metal with darkness, because they're looking at the brightness of the metal and where to hammer. And so not only was it hot, it's fiery, and they're working in dark, but then they would come out, and it was today blacksmithing is not as dirty of a practice in that you don't get covered in soot because you're not working with coals. But back then it was very dirty. You would inhaling smoke. And so you would be physically dirty. You would be very strong and probably intimidating in your physical features. Your eyes would likely be like red from smoke. You would cough a lot from inhaling all of that smoke, and you might be coughing black soot. And so all of these things probably contributed to this idea that they were in league with the devil.
Well, I actually, as you're saying this, I'm thinking the opposite. I'm thinking that it's about power. And when you're talking about witchcraft, how often do we use witchcraft when we refer to men? Not very often. This is the first time actually I've heard it in a conversation. We always think of witchcraft with women, and women are healers. Women were taught back, in the first civilizations to be healers, and their witchcraft is about an alchemy of healing. But we never see, or so seldom see, women as witches as powerful. And fairy tales, yes, the witches are powerful and they are evil. But what you're talking about with the blacksmith is these are alchemists. These are mages, and so when faced with the devil, they win. In all the versions you're talking about and the version I'm focusing on, they win. And so there is this sort of inherent assumption that don't mess with a blacksmith. Even if you think the blacksmith has out witchcraft, the blacksmith can, show up the devil. And so if the devil is supposed to be the most evil entity on the planet, and the blacksmith can conquer him, don't mess with the blacksmith. So the witchcraft, it's just very interesting to me how the line is drawn, how the men get off being alchemists and mages, and yet women who are considered witches are burned at the stake. So very
there are good
right?
witches in fairy tales, like fairy godmothers, right? They generally are helpful witches, so they're not always burned at the stake. But yes, that is a very important point as well.
Yeah.
And
So
I do think And I do think that you're hitting on the heart of the story, is that we want to be able to overcome the trickster, like trick the trickster, right? If you were being tricked in a lot of variations, the devil is trying to trick the blacksmith, but the blacksmith overcomes his trickery by devising his own
Maybe, and you
tricks.
could say, let me see, Betty said maybe the blacksmith's fire is part of the origin of hell and hellfire. Sounds good. Yeah. Although this actually is exactly what I wanted to talk about, because again, it's humans. We put judgment on these dualities, and the whole idea of the devil being a fallen angel. Fallen has a negative connotation. God is supposed to be in the heavens, and Satan, Lucifer, whatever, is supposed to be in hell and fire. And yet there is duality in everything in the universe. We have, if we know all these things, but it's very important to point out there's up and down, there's happy and sad, there's a beginning and an end, there's, hot and cold. We are the ones who put judgments on those dualities. So is the devil inherently evil? I personally have taken the sort of perspective of saying, I don't think so. And in this story, the devil, we could say it's a trickster, because in this story that I read, the devil made the woman younger. When the husband came, the devil just sort of hid and didn't have anything to do with it and let the blacksmith essentially kill the husband. But afterwards, he brought the man back to life and saved the blacksmith. And so there isn't this bad and good. The devil is not necessarily evil. He taught the blacksmith a lesson, and it was the rich wife who I find questionable.
Yeah. Yes, you're right. In the Russian version, the devil is not really a trickster, is he? He just wants to be respected, and there's no soul taking in that story. That is very fascinating. But there is the Christian element in it as well, because the picture comes from a church that the blacksmith attended, right? The picture of the devil came from the church, and then he just decided that he really liked it and he wanted it up in his own smithy. But in no way does he do any tricking. Yeah, he doesn't do any tricking in the Russian version, which I would be curious to hear if there was stories, an older version of that story, pre-Christian, and what that one sounded like. And the same goes for all of the other ones that I found, because they all kind of go through a Christian. And I kept being interested, because St. Peter comes in, and in several of the versions, and he grants 3 wishes. And I'm like, that's a weird thing. I don't know of any other story where St. Peter grants 3 wishes, because a lot of times in other versions, it's a genie that is granting wishes, not St. Peter. So I feel like he was just kind of put in there as in place of the original character.
It's very possible. I would love to, if you don't mind checking Instagram to see if there are any questions there, because
I'm seeing questions. Well, not any questions, just people saying, my dad's family were Shetlanders. I grew up on the Ainsley in Wales. I know pagans who say he's the good guy because he punishes the bad. That was a while ago. The hoof is like a nail with no nerves. Oh, that was because I wasn't clear on what a horse's hoof. The jester is closest to the king.
Interesting.
So those are all some of the comments that we have there. I did find some research that talked a little bit about why, some other research that wasn't from my husband, that talked a little bit about why the class position of blacksmiths. And you were talking about how they were revered, and that was true. But they also talked about how their position was marginalized in a way that, because they're a laborer, so laborers are generally not well revered, but they supply both the higher classes and the lower classes with things that they absolutely need, especially like swords. And so there was a study called The Sword in the Anglo-Saxon England by Hilda Ellis Davidson. And she says the sword was closely associated with much of what was most significant in a man's life: family ties, loyalty to his lord, the duties of a king, the excitement of battle, the attainment of manhood, and the last funeral rites. A certain mystery hung over the creation of a good sword, and the poets associated such weapons with gods and giants and long dead heroes of the past. And so I think that it goes back to the duality of talking about, but more so for the blacksmith, because the blacksmith holds this very strange position. He's a laborer, so generally not usually a respectable field, but because this particular labor is such a requirement for any sort of war, any sort of higher class individual, they have to go to a blacksmith in order to get a sword, or in order to go to war, they have to have these weapons. And so he is absolutely a central pillar of society, but he is also kind of in this hovel banging away in the darkness in fiery in a fiery place. And so it's just this kind of weird juxtaposition is what I think they were alluding to, this forging mythic connections to the past with labors strengthened between the heroes and the causes. So it was just kind of this weird position.
And it's really interesting because as you're talking again, you're giving me some, you're sort of the impetus for some connections. And Betty's comment too, that the blacksmith fire is part of the origin of hell and hellfire. And what your husband said was, it's easier for a blacksmith to work in the dark. And the blacksmith was working with fire, and there's sparks flying all over the place, which is very similar to what we think of as hell, if we're thinking of Dante's hell, you know? And so again, we have a blacksmith working in a dark place with sparks coming out and dealing with the devil all the time. So is it a collaboration? Is it just the power of the devil personified by a man with a hammer? I mean, I would like to go back and look at Hephaestus, the Greek god who created miraculous products, just incredible things. His imagination was unbelievable. He was not considered evil.
Right. And also his counterpoint in Roman mythology, Vulcan, had his forge inside of a volcano. And people thought when the volcano was supposed to erupt, he was just working to make new armor for the hero Aeneas. And as he headed into the battle of the Book of Eight, I'm not really sure what that was. But there were also, I found some people who talked about how Hephaestus was revered and people would give him gifts because he was just so important. He was a god of fire as well as blacksmith. And so he just had a lot of reverence attributed to him. So that was interesting.
Yeah, I think what we're coming to at the end of this conversation is that the blacksmith and the devil seem to be very tied together. And I'm beginning to understand why. So I'm really going to need to think about this partnership, or maybe they are the same person. I mean, one thing I really liked in the story also is the devil came down to teach this boy a lesson. But instead of just teaching him a lesson, first he learned the art of blacksmith. He really devoted himself to it. And what happened? The 16-year-old blacksmith, 15, 16-year-old blacksmith, fell in love with the devil because he really wanted to first respect the boy, and he wanted respect back and got it. So it's just a very interesting juxtaposition of how we approach things. He could have come down and just sort of sent him to hell, if you believe in hell. And he didn't. He made sure he learned respect.
I have a comment that barbers were surgeons. So that is very interesting. They held a very interesting role in society as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Every time I think of it, I'm just so glad I do not have a beard in this life anyway. The whole
That's true.
Not going to make me very comfortable. So I think I think we did it again.
Yeah, I think this is a great episode. Yeah, and so we thank you for everybody for all of your comments and your questions. And if you are watching on YouTube, and if you watch later on, we'd love to hear your comments and your thoughts, your opinions. Did we get it correct? Were you able to find another variation? Maybe the original. I'm not sure if we have an original variation, but a different one than one of the ones that we talked about today. And what were your thoughts about seeing it through different lenses? And is there a connection with the blacksmith and the devil? Why is that connection there? We want to hear your thoughts about this as well.
And let's
looks like you're thinking about something.
No, sorry, I was like, and let's think a little bit about the origins of people's reputations and whether they're deserving of those reputations or not. And we need to be a bit reflective, very reflective, to decide how we personalize that information instead of just acting the way everyone else around us is acting, like that. Okay. And Betty has a comment about Faust, since you brought it up. Making deal with the devil is a common theme in musical history. Very interesting. Yeah, it's,
Oh, it's an opera. It's an opera. Okay, so yes, I knew that there were several different versions. I was looking on Wikipedia because it was connected to this story, and there's lots of different versions of Faust, but I was not familiar with it. So I'm glad. That's my aunt. She was a musician, so she would have that knowledge as well.
Betty, yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. To think about what we're doing for next month.
Yes, well, we had several suggestions. One was Baba Yaga. One was I can't even remember how to say it. The Irish or the Welsh story. Emma. Yeah, you had Baba Yaga. I have at least 3 suggestions from audience members. So we'll be putting those out soon, I think, because we've already had a lot of people who shown interest in what we're going to talk about next month. So, and make sure if you're listening that you hit subscribe on whether you're watching on YouTube or if you're listening on the podcasting platform. Hit subscribe so you get your notifications every week or month whenever these podcasts come out. So that you get notifications. So thanks for joining us on this Fairy Tale Flip episode 6. I'm Vanessa Y. Rogers with Fabric of Folklore, and this is
Donna Fields from Doorways to Learning. Very happy to be in both podcasts.
And we're so glad that you joined us, and we can't wait till next month.
Hey, thanks everyone.
Keep the fairy tales alive.